dua cek cek satu dua cek.
We're almost ready, Malik. Just a few words. Isolde is asking people to join coming back to the rooms.
Cek. Cek. Oke.
Di enable screen sharing buat Malik ya. Enable screen sharing. Enable screen sharing buat Malik. I'm asking them now.
What's the order, Arun?
Rita, you, and then Hyun class.
Okay. All right.
Halo? Hah? Iya, makanya harus dites. Malik, if you can hear me, do you want to try to share your first slide maybe to check that you?
Yeah, it's okay. It's all right now.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Oren.
Cek, cek. Cek, cek. Udah.
Oh, just thank you for okay. Okay. You are set. Sorry. Yes, 25 minutes. So that was important. I don't have that much to pay. That's okay. I would like you don't have to pay the delay. Yeah, boleh jadi laptop gua, tapi malah set. Okay, yes. Sure. You current everything okay? Good. Yeah. Ya, ini telah mulai semua orang ya hari 4 ya live record udah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome again to the afternoon plenary talk on the overlooked cities and in Asia, interrogating blind field in urban knowledge and praxis. It's an honor to have this keynote plenary with all the wonderful, fantastic speaker. I'm going to, and really absolute pleasure and really grateful for their generosity of times, support and everything from this wonderful speaker. And I'm going to invite them to join me on the front. Unfortunately, one of our speaker due to personal circumstances cannot join us in person, but I'll introduce him in a moment. So the first speaker is Dr. Rita Padawangi. She is an associate professor of sociology at Center for University Core Singapore University of Social Science. If you would like to join us at the front. The second one is Professor Abdul Malik Simon, Senior Professorial Fellow at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield, who is joining us online. The third speaker, I would like to invite Professor Hyun Bang Shin, who will be joining us in a moment toward the end of the keynote plenary. We will have him. Professor Hyun Bang Shin is the professor of geography and urban studies at the London School of Economic and Political Science, and the former director of the Southeast Asia Center. We have quite a number of online audience joining us from across the world. So we open the plenary, keynote plenary for within our network for the people that are interested that were supposed to joining us as part of the conference, but unfortunately due to personal circumstances, family emergency cannot join us online. We'll have the order with the kind of broad opportunity for all the speaker to say comment reflection on how they think, what they think about what is overlooked cities. First from Dr. Rita Padawangi, and then followed by Professor Abdul Malik Simon, and then finally Professor Hyun Bang Shin. And then hopefully toward the end, we'll have an opportunity for kind of a comment reflection from the audience in general and about how you thought and how you would like to contribute to the topic. So to kick off the keynote plenary, again, the overlooked cities in Asia, interrogating blind field in urban knowledge and practice. I'd like to invite Dr. Rita Padawangi to share her remarks, the talk on which is entitled "To Overlook, to Look Over." Her. So the floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see all of you here, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Erin, and thank you for the Overlook Cities team for inviting me to this occasion. This is such a pleasure to me, meeting new people as well as reconnecting with old colleagues. And my own presentation today, I would say that I wouldn't want to claim that I'm an expert in overlooked cities because I'm not the one who published the book on overlooked cities. So you have the team who published the book is actually, they are sitting right here. So what I'm going to present today is more of my own reflections. And when I see the word overlooked cities, and also I was telling Erwin that I'm so tempted of doing some provocations as well, but I'm not sure how much that will come across. So when I thought about overlooked cities, I kept thinking to myself, what does that mean? What I mean, and I've also listened to the discussion just now. There are lots of questions about what do we mean by overlooking. Um, so want to I want to start actually with this image right here. Um, and I just want to ask the audience, and I'm sure at least one or two can recognize where this picture was taken from. Any of you recognize which city this is? It's very difficult, isn't it? We all come from all over the world. If we show like a photo of a city that is not a capital city whatsoever, then it's very difficult to actually recognize which city this is. So I started with my own reflection of the term overlook itself, and that's why I chose this title, to overlook and to look over, which I think, what does it mean? Not just about the book itself, but what does it mean when we as researchers are researching on overlooked cities? And as I thought about it, then I thought, okay, there's another term actually here, which is to look over, but then I'll save that term for later. By the way, I chose this image is also because we are here now in Indonesia. And this image is a really beautiful image is a coastal city somewhere very far from here. And this is actually, yes, it is. I'm watching this. I see the participants. I was like, okay, there was one from Jayapura right here. Yeah, this is actually from the Hamadi area in Jayapura. Yeah, during sunset. Now, if we look at this image, and then we see, is this thing working? No, okay. And then we see this image. It's also a coastal city. And I'm very sure that more people, maybe not all, will recognize which city this is. Yes, of course. And this is Jakarta. So I would like to start with these two images because I somehow have these two photos with me, and I feel that so this is an image from Jakarta, and this is an image from Jayapura. While if we say, okay, overlooked cities are cities that are rarely represented in maybe in literatures, or cities that are rarely seen in publications and all that. But then when we look at this image, somehow the image of the fishermen docking at the coast is really beautiful. And even this area has been improved, has been a subject of a recent infrastructure improvement, right? The walkway across, and it becomes actually a touristy place. This area in Jakarta is also where was also where the fishermen were docking in the coast. And while we can say that Jakarta is a city that has been seen too much in Indonesia, but this area in particular was actually subject to forced evictions, and it was considered an area that is not fitting to the city of Jakarta stature, despite the fact that this kind of image, having fishermen actually docking on the coast of a coastal city, should have been one of the characteristics of the city. But why is such a different treatment? So again, I don't claim to be an expert in overlooked cities, but as I'm thinking about these two images, and also the experiences that I have in observing several cities over the past few years, then I keep thinking, when we say we overlook city, but what is actually overlooked? To what extent is it overlooked? And why has it been overlooked? Who is overlooking and whom is being overlooked? And what are the implications of overlooking? And who are the most affected by overlooking? And my intention of actually posting all this, I don't intend to answer them. Okay, I'm just sharing what actually comes to my mind when we say overlooked cities. The question of what is being overlooked and why is it overlooked, and who is affected, who is being overlooking. So this is another image that I thought, as I was thinking about overlooking, this is an image from Taman Kalijodo in Jakarta. So if we see this kind of image, and likely we say, okay, it's a playground, it's a public space. It seems that all these children are having a good time. But it's just if we just look at this image, probably we won't know that the creation of this place actually also involved a hasty forced eviction several years ago. And the forced eviction was actually has been deemed as a human rights violation. So by experiencing the space also, it can actually, or by seeing this kind of photos, it might also constitute the fact, that we might be led to overlook some of these issues. And if we look at, if we look at this photo, for example, this is another photo also recently taken. As I was thinking about overlooking and, these experiences about seeing places with that has been subjected to forced evictions, then I'm actually tempted to also show this photo in which we can see that there is clearly a bridge here. Yeah. And this bridge is actually very much used by the people here. But on the map, there is no bridge, of course. On the map, the bridge is somewhere here, and the bridge is actually being renovated by the city government. So the bridge itself, this bridge is not nowhere in the map, but this is the bridge that is used every day by the residents, while the bridge while the bridge on the map is being renovated by the government. But the bridge that is being renovated is on the map and is being noted as you cannot pass through. So if you follow Google Map, of course, you can't actually find this bridge. So this is also something that is often overlooked. And this has something to do, to me, that by overlooking this bridge, we are also overlooking the people who actually make this bridge and the people who are using this bridge. So the question of who is very much related to the question of what. And when it gets to the infrastructures like this, crossing a major river, this is River Ciliwung, by the way, that flows all the way to Jakarta. So major infrastructures like this usually is done by the government. But when it's not the government who is doing it, and when it's in the scale like this, it's not on the map. And speaking of the River Ciliwung, the next image that we're going to see is also from River Ciliwung. And it's very difficult to overlook this thing, right? Because it's really, really super big. And this is actually the development of a dam, of a reservoir, for flood control. Also, that's how it's being proposed. So to control the flooding that goes all the way to Jakarta. So by having a city like Jakarta downstream, this kind of landscape is very much associated with the city of Jakarta, even though it's actually very far away. And all these interventions on this landscape is being done for the sake of the city that is like maybe 60 kilometers away from this point. So the city that is very far from this point is being looked at, but this place and all the impacts of this project, who is actually looking after them? Who is looking over them? And definitely these are often the kinds of collaterals of development that is associated with some kind of progress. And these communities are the ones that are being overlooked in these cases. So the communities that are subjected to development of the dam, the communities who built that bridge, and this is another community in the north coast of Jakarta. This is an old article, by the way, and I think the project has been abandoned as well. But when this project was really promoted in around 2014, it is the project that everyone wants to see, and there is an overlooking of this population that is affected. And what are the implications of overlooking? So to me, as a scholar, I feel that we always need to ask ourselves, why are we studying overlooked cities? Why do we actually care? And I would say that because the the implications of overlooking can have really real implications, and that can actually exacerbate the even more practices of overlooking. And I don't need to explain these images because I think they are really self-explanatory, and they're very much connected to the cases that I presented before, the dam and also the parks and all that. So to overlook, just going back to this image again, to this list of questions, what is overlooked? To what extent is it overlooked? Why has it been overlooked? Who is overlooking and whom is being overlooked? What are the implications of overlooking, and who are the most affected? So the previous images, I was showing you all the development projects and the impacts to those who are being overlooked. But I would argue also there is another thing that has been overlooked here, which is actually the kinds of developments that are not in the eyes of those who are overlooking. So if we want to find the traces of progress, the traces of solutions to our problems of today, oftentimes we find them in places that are overlooked. And I would say that the practice of overlooked, what is being overlooked is not just about the spaces, the communities that are, and these communities are not really powerless in the sense that they also actively use their own agency to try to solve the situation, to try to not be overlooked. Whether they are successful or not to overcome the condition of being overlooked, that's of course depending on the various situations that they are in. So some actually get attention from the media. Doesn't mean that the job is done, but some others might not, and got displaced. So there are so many practices of communities in these smaller spaces that are often overlooked, and they are overlooked by the ones who are making decisions over the spaces. And in studying overlooked cities, therefore, we also want to see what is our purpose and how should we do it. And so I actually take this from the book itself. And to be overlooked is somewhat to be neglected and somewhat to be in the margins. And the practice of overlooking is a process that is filled with presuppositions, prejudices, prioritizations, and expectations, be it intentional or unintentional. Yeah. So sometimes what we encounter in the field also is also we may know a lot of things, right? But to study overlooked cities actually also involved caring for the overlooked. I think it's somewhere in the book itself. Yeah. Or being overlooked or overlooking something actually also involves if you know something but you don't care about it, right? Knowing but not caring, right? So this actually addresses, at least when I ask myself, why should I be interested in overlooked cities? To study overlooked cities, does it mean that we care about overlooked cities? And I would like to say, at least for me, I study because I care. Yeah. And and next is actually the trying to ask ourselves, okay, so we care about these overlooked cities, but then if we want to start addressing overlooked cities, probably we also need to think about why have cities been overlooked. And this here is, I would argue that because of the existing paradigms of how the city should be developed, how the city should be built, and there's this sense of pragmatism in research, which also drives this paradigm of cities as engines of economic growth. And there are assumption of certain images of a desirable future to be achieved through prescribed strategies for development. Yeah. So, and these prescribed strategies for development are often technocratic, and often involve investment-driven narratives that exacerbate power inequalities in urban development. And so in this situation, progress for some often comes at a cost of displacement of others. And here I'm actually showing this image here. This is an image about eviction of becaks in Jakarta. Becak is this three-wheel, maybe you can call it trishaw, pedicabs, and they are like expanded bicycles, right? And they have been banned from the streets of Jakarta for a long time, and there has been debates about it, because they have not fit into this notion of progress. So the notion of progress, it comes at a cost of displacement of others. And this is ironic because at the same time, we know that nowadays we talk about low carbon emission. We promote cycling in cities. But at the same time, why are they being overlooked? This technology has been around for the longest time, and they have been overlooked. They are not seen as a nice, as a nice solution for our cities. So it has to be something that is very grand, so that it can be seen, or it doesn't get looked at. So I would say that to research on overlooked cities is really a commitment for the researchers to look over. And to look over means to care, to look after, to look over. And first, to look over these overlooked cities, which means that we need to have full recognition that urban development is always political, and therefore studying urban development must be critical. And I've said this before in other publications, and I feel that this is also an appropriate time to sort of also bring this up again. So there's an element of criticality that needs to be there when we study overlooked cities. Second is that we need full recognition also, that full awareness that the choice of study perspectives is not just academic, but it has real implications for the future of cities. And I have these images here of the new capital city proposal that is going on in Indonesia here, because when we look at the study of cities, this kind of development will involve researchers as well. And as researchers who care about overlooked cities, how would we actually see this critically? And what kind of stance will we have on these kinds of projects? I think that's something that we need to always think about when we try to remind ourselves, why are we even studying overlooked cities? And third, studying cities have real implications. So we as researchers always have to think of what the methods would imply, the methods that we choose to study the overlooked cities, and what the implications would bring, and to whom they would matter. Yeah, I guess here I really want to emphasize that studying overlooked cities is actually a commitment. And the reason to study overlooked cities goes beyond publications, because there is always the population in the margins that becomes the subject of our study. And what will that imply to how we are studying them and how we are studying the cities? So I borrow these images from a kampong in Jakarta that is already evicted right now. And just to quickly translate, the image on the left says, "In the name of development," criticizing evictions in the name of development. The image in the center says, "Stop evictions," and the image on the right say, "We are useful kampong, and we are not garbage." So with that, I'll just close off. As I said, I'm not going to claim that I know a lot over overlooked cities. And my intention here is just to provoke all of us to think about why we are even studying overlooked cities and what will be our own mission in committing ourselves to look over the overlooked cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rita, for that. I think a lot of provocation questions that we have to think about through for the next 2 days. I'm not going to summarize, so we're going to move ahead with the second speaker, Professor Abdul Malik Simon. So Abdul Malik Simon is a senior professor fellow at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield. He worked across the issue on spatial composition in extended urban region, the direction of everyday life for urban majority in the global south, infrastructural, like imaginary, collective effect, global blackness, and his storage of the present for Muslim working classes. So without further ado, Professor Abdul Malik Simon will deliver a talk on which entitled Inoperable Relations, Urban Life at the Extension. So over to you, Malik.
Okay, thank you, Erwin. Thank you, everyone, for your work and for all of the really great presentations today. I even know less than Rita about this thing, so but what I'm going to try to emphasize is a kind of process of overlooking, which is a kind of materialization of going beyond the familiar entities and the processes that characterize our sort of common vernaculars about urbanization. And so to use the notion of extending as a kind of materialization of overlooking, and some thoughts from a collective of researchers that have been working together for 2 years on developing some of these notions. So just some initial images. Okay, so we may know about the notion of extended urbanization from Lefebvre and scholars that have been working in that vein. And we may know that it refers to the multifaceted processes through which urbanization articulates different logics and territories. Yet we think that extended urbanization has a very limited notion of the notions of extending and extensions, that extensions instead reflect a going beyond that can take place anywhere, and which is manifested not only in new territorial formations, but also in different new ways of living and in new ways of inhabiting. So acts of extending urban form and life don't simply reproduce the dominant modes of valuation, but rather extending unsettles, it disrupts familiar categorization, as inhabitants attempt to situate themselves in the midst of increasingly unsettled terrain. And so extensions and extending then are at the basis of an interplay between attempts to resettle and unsettle. So it is within this kind, it's a kind of middle position between a constant kind of process of resettling and unsettling, which in some sense characterize much of the politics of inhabitation today. So to extract as much as possible, but also to operate where nothing apparent is to be gained, nothing useful to the prolongation either of the urban or of life. So extensions are spatial, insofar as sites, contexts, and institutions overstep their boundaries and extend themselves out into the world. We see this in the way in which dimensions are added onto houses, streets, or neighborhoods, but then these added dimensions take on a life of their own, often emerging out of multiple overlapping tenure regimes or regulatory frameworks. They're also corporeal, bodily, in the sense of how particular kinds of bodies extend themselves into the earth to preclude exhaustive extractions, and how bodies may be renewed beyond recognizable modalities of social reproduction. And that's particularly important in terms of work being done in Latin America on notions of extended social reproduction, the ways in which when particular forms and modalities of social reproduction are foreclosed, what are new modes, new invented modes through which bodies and bodily care and bodily capacities are reproduced, often in ways that are very difficult, sometimes very difficult to detect or to institutionalize. And extensions are also a temporal matter. When time is extended or suspended during crisis or transition, through slow and fast forms of policy and governance, through waiting it out and anticipating better futures, and when the city is haunted by all of that. And extensions are also existential. Both the terms of recomposing the intersections of life and death, the way in which life and death is concretized, and the way in which the powers in life and death are extended into each other through technicities and even more brazen and expanded displays. So in this constant shift of extensions, operations are always in motion, animated by aspirations and desires that are also always in flux. So multiple ambitions, competencies, and capacities converge in the unceasing reclaiming of land, resources, time, and imagination. And sometimes extensions entail edges and interstices, whose intensities of occupation waver depending upon the time of day, and a series of rhythmic surges and ebbs would also constitute the basis for other extensions. And here we see in so many classic settlements, built environments, the ways in which the distinctions of buildings and spatial products can blur into each other, as the layering of different and sometimes countervailing tenure statuses, situated histories of inhabitation and in use, extend, for example, the apartment block into a series of kiosks, resting spaces for motorbike taxi drivers, backyard shacks that host music clubs and card games, and small shrines to disparate spirits, a makeshift shelter for those awaiting transport, a small vegetable and flower garden, or an impromptu car washing business. That is part of the ability of any built environment to, in some sense, stabilize itself, means in some sense also unsettling itself, extending, doing different things with the possibilities suggested by any particular kind of tenure status or use or occupation. So all of these spaces have been generated by different actors under different pretexts and negotiations and claims of proprietorship and responsibilities for maintenance. They not only blur a sense of original structure, but also importantly blur the proportionality of authority at work. That is, blur a kind of precise accounting of who does what to who. And for us, this is a really important point. How the way in which how do you imagine and materialize life beyond value, beyond the calculation of value? Seeing value is always in some sense racialized, always a sense of entailing subjugation. And so how can you blur that kind of proportionality of who counts and who doesn't? And how does that show up in particular kinds of urban situations and environments. At other times, extensions operate as a means of tying together discrepant contexts in varying degrees of mutual implication. Those who sell household goods in a market may join a common church that is also attended by union members who work in cleaning municipal offices, who in turn order supplies from this market, which is also involved in cooperative housing savings groups sponsored by still another church somewhere else. Extensions also start from a kind of default position of the city. The city is some kind of coherent locus for the self-reflecting subject, which has been, in some sense, the kind of embodiment of a modernity which always needs to exclude, always needs to extinguish, always needs to subjugate. So rather, always starting from the position of the city as broken compacts, solidarities, connections, interdependencies. So then the importance of the extensions, not as the fractal replication of format or formula, but entanglements amongst the brokenness, entanglements amongst pieces and ways of doing things and forces which are not in some sense coherent or whole or those of integrity. Entanglements of different locations, different ways of living, different games of getting by, different logics and identities of what any given place might be. And not the repair of brokenness, but brokenness as a default condition that suggests its own possible dispositions. And so extensions, not so much as a place, but a process of extending across various lines, across different zones, functions, locations, ideas, and temporalities. Extensions take place, as I said, also at the level of the body and circulation. Bodies that find the effort to stabilize through consolidating place, acquiring assets, and maximizing consumption. All of these things that really characterize a certain kind of urban middle class offer an increasingly limited horizon. There's too much labor, too much indebtedness, too much compliance. And therefore we see that social life is being distributed across and livelihood across multiple locations and opportunities, where the notion of itineraries becomes more important than that of emplacement. So the urban is the constant recalibration of movement, constantly recalibrated by movement, even when people are stuck in place in particular built environments adamantly hold on. There yet can be a sense there yet can be a kind of sense of movement. So here endurance is less a function of cemented ties of people to place, but it's a continuous repositioning of a place, continuous repositioning of a tea stall or a restaurant or a small factory to a shifting realignment of broken details. So when they talk about inoperable relations, is that somehow that these are repositories or geyser-like eruptions, even whose specific location and force of discharge can never be known in advance. Repositories of inclinations, of long histories of experiments and conjunctions and conjoint projects, sometimes amongst unwitting participants that seem to intentionally avoid assuming the form where they would be subject to political contestation or empirical verification. Relations that are inoperable in the sense that they're not to be proved, they're not to be empirically validated, they're not to be institutionalized, they're not to become the stuff through which new things are necessarily made of. But relations that are proposed, that are detached from obvious genealogy, that compress things conventionally viewed as impossible to be together, and that have no way of knowing whether or not they will endure or not. And oftentimes are not interested in the question of whether they endure or not. Because in some ways, if endurance becomes the primary question, then there's all kinds of compensations and compromises that have to be made And those compromises have to be made in many aspects of life, but there are also other aspects about the urban and the generativity of the urban that can't be involved in whether things last or not. So the urban is an array of technical dimensions that come from all over the place and work in different degrees and proportions and manifestations that come to create urbanization, but also do not intrinsically belong to it. So things like motors and perceptions and enunciations and constructions and couplings and processing and conversions and metabolisms and flows and harvesting and catalyzing, all of these are different technical dimensions that come together at times in complementary, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes parallel ways to begin to materialize particular kinds of dispositions and particular kinds of opportunities and particular kinds of spaces. Particularly at the extensions just beyond what has customarily been purported to be the real city. Around peripheries and hinterlands, it is increasingly evident that a continuous recalibration of projects and material inputs and residues and altered ecologies of reciprocal causation are generating landscapes that exceed the salience of all the vocabulary we know about analysis and intervention. And here, there are intricate landscapes of provisional sutures and half-lives and diffractions and disjuncture and compensation and transience that create unsettled urbanities and unsettled populations. And that in that we have to learn much more from that kind of process of unsettlement rather than simply to see unsettlement as a kind of problem to be solved. So instead of eventually finding optimal solutions or ways of settling in for the long run, these reciprocal relations between fungible built environments and the more provisional plans and maneuvers of residents make up the stage for the very process of continuous extending, as available formulas, dispositions, and calculations prove insufficient in and of themselves and must extend themselves outward once again. So the extensions are not the rolling out of a specific logic or form, but it's the continuous process of extending, going beyond, overlooking the kind of familiar comfort zone vocabularies, which become its own self-generating dynamic, albeit amidst many different kinds of structural constraints. But what's important is the way in which this all points to movement, not simply migration or mobility or circulation, but movement as a critical force as people and materials and landscapes and discourses and other entities move with and across each other in ways which extend what can be known about and anticipated from them, and induce a measure of spaciousness to the regimes of computation which seek to more precisely define the parameters through which these entities relate with each other, and which in some ways reinforce this oppressive notion of value and proportionality. So thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
It's about overlook city. Boris. Yeah, I think we can clear. Yeah.
Okay, so I always seem to find myself speaking just before having lunch or dinner, and which also means I can't really go on forever and ever. And some of the things I was hoping to say were being said by Rita. So what I was trying to do during this 25 minutes is sort of reflection on my own activities as Center Director of Soci Hope Southeast Asia Center that was running this early career research network, and also some of the reflections I was having during the time of COVID, but also reflections of my own academic career as an Asian researcher who was finding myself in a very white geography society in the UK and having gone through the whole process of career advancement and survival and so on and so forth. And also always finding myself back in Asia, which is my root, and trying to also negotiate my own positionality. As someone who's from Asia, working in the UK, often going back to Asia to do my work, also to try to interact with colleagues and students in Asia as well. So all of these are kind of feeding into this to think about this politics of theorizing from about overlooked cities, where I kind of replaced Asian cities with overlooked cities, because kind of in my own dilemma and thinking about what it means to practice academic scholarship as a researcher working on Asian cities seemed to be pretty much resonating with what is being kind of discussed in relation to overlooked cities, largely because Asian cities have been overlooked in Western academia in the same way African cities or many cities in the global South used to be overlooked. So that's kind of where I come from. And I try to make it as quick as possible. And I probably skip this one only because probably you already know about these kind of comments about how these cities are being overlooked. And I want to just to say, regarding this Google's book, which is quite interesting and inspirational, that came out in 2004. When you look at the case studies, you actually see in cities like Cairo, Moscow, or Jakarta, and Joburg. And imagine this is 20 years ago, and many of these cities would have been overlooked at the time. Over the years, they have gained their prominence, and some more than others, and they become more pretty much frequently mentioned and studied cities like Joburg or Jakarta, even Jakarta, and we get to see more papers on Jakarta nowadays, thanks to some researchers working on these. So there's a kind of historical evolution over time where cities become overlooked and being overly looked, right? In any case, we also agree with Anyana Roy's in a discussion that there's still concern regarding the lack of many sites from which we can theorize from. And of course, we also have other kind of scholars who are talking about the whole presence of, for example, the short work on the discussion about the negligence of black hole cities, like those cities which are pretty big in their own presence and politically and demographically, cities which are not identified in the study by Globalization World Cities in the center, and cities which were not sharing any national territory with the world city, or not having not being identified as world city at the time. So we have these kind of existing discussions where commonly discussing, we're reporting, identifying the absence of cities and overlooked cities being very much in the urban studies discipline. And over the years, especially with the shifting geopolitical economic dynamics, some cities becoming more, receiving more attention, like many cities in China, in line with China's rise as global economic and political power. We get to see more stories coming up from China, obviously. And that's again reflecting the historical changes in terms of what is being overlooked and what is being looked. And of course, I just want to say, many of these books do contribute to more cities being receiving attention. And thank you for those authors who have contributed, and editors who have contributed to this whole endeavor. And the question is, going back to Rita's question, I was like, hey, Rita's stealing my line, who's overlooking what? And this is where I kind of, probably take a different take, especially when here, I'm kind of thinking about all of you guys who are sitting here in this room, and we all kind of sort of operate in isolation. Of course, you kind of interact, and this is where you're trying to make connections so that you don't feel isolated. But nevertheless, that whole feeling of isolation and feeling of, am I the only one person who's interested in my own city from my region when I operate and study and work in an institution based in, for example, in Australia, UK? You feel kind of, who am I? Where's my partner? Where's my kind of people that I want to make connection with? People who I can form sort of solidarity. And this is where I try to kind of say a few things about this, and also trying to invite you guys to think about these throughout the whole 3 days. And that's my own way of kind of emphasizing it's really important that you make friendship here, so that you go back to your own site of operation, but you feel you are connected. And I hope that connection becomes the kind of an asset that you can work with in order to make sure you nurture the scholarship on overlooked cities. And here at the same time, I want to kind of highlight the politics that exist within existing national territories, right? So there's an inherent tendency to focus on first-tier cities or capital cities like Jakarta in Indonesia, and Beijing or Shanghai in China, or Seoul, of course, in South Korea. And many national researchers that you may speak to will be working pretty much on these key cities. For where some meaningful and understandable regions, they actually dominate in each national territory, politically very important, economically also very influential, culturally very important, like my own country, South Korea. Seoul basically dominates over and above all other cities, and therefore, when you people talk about housing policy at the national level, very often it ends up being housing policy in Seoul context, and people take it as if this is about the entire country, but in essence, it's really about Seoul. And that actually gets replicated in many other kind of contexts across the world. And I think this is where we end up finding ourselves fighting the struggle. You want to kind of look at these overlooked cities at regional and at the urban margins, but very much you actually have to fight within your own territory to kind of make your cities, which are overlooked, to be more pronounced in the context of the heavy kind of a domination of certain cities, which occupy all the attention from the policy circles as well as academic circles. So a lot of the national funding bodies, government, non-governmental institutions, they hesitate to support studies which are looking at more peripheral, secondary, or interstitial spaces and cities. And this is where your dilemmas also kick in. So for those people, for those of us who are working on cities which are overlooked, in whichever way you define them, on the one hand, you struggle to make them pronounced and recognized in the global scholarship. But on the other hand, and at the same time, you also have to struggle to make them pronounced and recognized within each national territory as well. There's a kind of a double struggles that you encounter. So the hegemonic cities, which are was kind of thinking about, referring to a small number of prime cities prominent in politics, economy, and cultural influence, they become the reference point of aspirational urbanism rooted in such cities, and they become overrepresented or overly looked by national researchers, even though they may be overlooked in the global scholarship as well. So here, what is overlooked, I just want to say, when you're actually trying to make them pronounced, I think there's at the global level, and here, when you try to make them pronounced and try to bring attention to these overlooked cities, you feel like you can collaborate with scholars who are having pretty much in a critical stance. So let's say critical urban scholars that you can work with. But I have to say there's still ongoing limitations, and I say this even on the basis of my own experience and as a professor in the UK and at the LSE, but also as an Niger editor, and I still observe these tendencies still being in place, which is there's kind of a lack of kind of invitations going out to scholars who are operating in regional at the margins, right? So I just take the example why I appreciate the effort by anti-post scholars to produce this in a very wonderful volume. So full credit given to contributors who are producing these 50 keyword descriptions. When you actually look at the list of contributors, just one person who is one of the co-authors of many authors for one keyword. Apart from that person, I think he's probably based in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia. Or the rest of the authors were from global North institutions. And you feel like, what about all these scholars who are regionally based and operating? Why do they not given this? Why are they not invited to have a voice in this kind of a very influential in a kind of summary of what they feel as kind of 50 keywords that actually characterize the critical urban scholarship? You get to wonder how about Karachi Urban Lab, for example, or Karachi City Lab, for example? Why couldn't we have simply a person from Karachi City Lab or Beirut Urban Lab, for example, or centers in Malaysia or elsewhere to contribute? I wouldn't say that's because they are intentionally neglecting them, but it's probably also the limitation of the network being in operation, where they probably have more people within their network that were unintentionally excluding the large a large number of scholars outside the global north remit, and therefore they simply neglected and overlooked in that process. So that's one thing, and in this regard, I would just want to say there's a need of us to give consideration to our own locality, and for me, Asia, and more specifically East and Southeast Asia. Or more narrowly, the urban that each one of us has thus far carried out empirical research as a starting point of a critical inquiry and the ending point of praxis, and that's what we try to do. And in doing so, we also try not to essentialize our own region, also not to take what Musavi was trying to say, the need of distancing away from nativist or tokenistic decolonization, so that we actually use our case studies to interact with the larger bodies of scholarship from the global north or from elsewhere. And that's something we have to do. But at the same time, I would probably also say, we need to fight this whole tendency of how people are sometimes systematically or sometimes unintentionally excluded from the process. I just kind of bring up this one from last year report on Niger, just to say, when you look at the whole submissions from authors, we actually have a lot of submissions coming from China or from Iran, India, Turkey, and so on. These submissions actually, most of them do not actually end up being accepted, and the authors whose papers are being accepted are largely based in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, Sweden. But they are not necessarily working on those countries, by the way. So you have many researchers who are writing about cities in India, based in the US, and so on. So you can't really make a clear simple judgment. But it does indicate, there's a bit of a absence and negligence. But also the practices of how to engage with the global debate, also something that needs to be highlighted. So if I just want to put together a few points for us to consider, and in this regard, I was kind of trying to look at all these questions from the perspective of decentering and decolonizing knowledge production. So there are dual processes of recentering local scholarship, especially strengthening the position of local scholarly outlets, as an example, and also decentering the production of knowledge by nurturing the growth of authors from outside the global north and situating cities overlooked nationally and globally. And here I kind of ask this question: how are we to establish this in the national context, and also and not just globally? Right? There's a need of strengthening the network of critical scholars, especially among those rooted in Asia, working closely with those who are from Asia, but operating in the global north or south institutions. So on the one hand, there's need of nurturing the locally embedded researchers. On the other hand, the need of producing this network of researchers who are operating elsewhere. There's also the need of promoting in-depth and therefore slow scholarship, because when you're trying to understand how cities are overlooked and what is being overlooked and also all these dynamics, it does require us to be very much having an in-depth understanding of the entire cultural, political, economic, social, and so on, all these relations that can be identified. All of these are something that are going to require a huge amount of time investment, right? And this doesn't really reconcile quite well with the neoliberal kind of academic environment within which you have to produce very quickly. And this is another challenge that we often face, and this is also becoming quite problematic in terms of addressing the limitation of cities being overlooked. There's also the need of redesigning academic collaboration, giving more voice to local partners. And I think the COVID situations gave us really an opportunity to think about what collaboration actually meant. And especially locally embedded researchers from outside the global north really having a chance to gain and claim the ownership of knowledge production so that they become more equal partners in operation. I think that it's not really gaining a full force, and we might return back to the kind of usual situation of local collaborators becoming very much instrumental, but not really gaining the knowledge production ownership. And I think that's something we need to fight on an ongoing basis. So just two more points. This is the second last slide. There's a need of supporting the network of especially early career scholars from the global south and east, whose intellectual endeavor faces multi-layered constraints due to censorship, gender hierarchy, seniority, and racial and ethnic inequality. And here gender becomes very much an issue. And I was told, and no offense to our colleagues in India, by the way, but when scholars were being invited from India to attend a conference elsewhere or invited workshops and so on, there's a kind of implicit, I was told, the kind of gendered hierarchy where senior researchers somehow prevent early career female researchers from representing the institution, which in some cases not happening, but in other cases it still does seem to be reproducing the gender hierarchy. And this is not just about India, but elsewhere there's these many different types of inequities and hierarchies that actually make work as a major constraint on early careers being independent and critical scholars. There's a need of scholars to retain their core locations that are sites of contestations, the examination of which would allow observers to reveal the conflicting relations. And these core locations are sites of where I would probably say, in the context of overlookedness, probably going back to what I was discussing earlier in the morning, the sites of overlaid and overlookedness, which might be the sites where various constraints and contradictions are becoming more visible than other sites. Scholars who have studied overly looked cities are to expand and reach out. So someone like me who started with the study on Beijing may need to reach out. And here I can say, I'm trying, but not, I guess, still trying to reach out to cities which are being overlooked in order to put those into conversations with each other, because these cities will have to have some reference point, but also they need to be understood in a relational way. And that's my own alarm. That's 20 minutes past, so I'll stop quite soon. And finally, there's need of kind of thinking about the duty of care and post-research ethics for them to kick in for critical scholars in order to enhance local ownership and strengthen the breadth and depth of critical scholars in each country. And so this is the last slide. And I'm just thinking about the spirit of Bandung conference. Three kind of concluding comments. Region-based scholars of diverse career stage to be given voices in both national and global scholarly environment and ensure their ownership and recognition of knowledge production. And this is where meaningful mentoring, relationship building, networking will have to happen in a way that actually constructively helps expand one's career into a direction that does contribute to critical urban scholarship expansion nationally and also globally. Requiring double movement on the one hand, decolonizing and decentering knowledge production from the global north, also decentering knowledge production from hegemonic cities in each country, so that cities like Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, or Seoul, Beijing, not becoming the only cities from which theories can be produced. Asian and African tone in critical urban studies by Asian scholars for Asia and Africa, and not only part of scholarly interest, but the inquiries concern the ontology and identity of the researchers who have best interest in the future of the region. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, you may work with scholars from elsewhere, but I think it will be really important to proactively think about how the scholars based in local context do sit in the driving seat of knowledge production, and on that basis enter into more kind of an equal foot-based kind of relationship building. And I think this is a huge challenge because of the way the whole neoliberal academic world has been structured and developed up until now. And it will be important to identify all those sympathetic kind of supporters in the global north, who can work with you, but at the same time, kind of self-reflection to think about how the kind of scholarship people carry out locally can be further contribute to ensuring the critical inquiries into their own cities and make sure that those are gaining some important footing in order for them not to dissipate, and also in order to make sure the isolation doesn't become the mode of operation, but networking and solidarity become the main mode of operation to make sure you don't become overlooked. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again, Professor Chin, for talk. Really impressive, and then thank you so much for reiterating where the place and why we are doing it in the context of London conference. I think when our collective are thinking about cultural development and why we choose London, and only that RDI is the first year. The idea that the London conference was here, and also in order to solidify the connection between the Asian and African scholar. This event is focusing on Asia, but of course the next event in Bloemfontein is trying to connect between Asia and Africa. Unfortunately, we only have 4 minutes left. But I think we can do it as maybe just one or two comment or question from the audience. But before that, I maybe invite Sarsin and Dr. Padawani to join me at the podiums. And for the audience, if you have any comment, reflection, can you just say it really quickly and concise within maximum 1 minute? If there's any comment, reflection, question from the audience here or online, if you online, can I check if there's any online comment question? Yeah. I think one thing that really struck me across this four talk, of course, they were all really thought-provoking, enriching, and really installed, and really provocative from what Dr. Padawani is trying to emphasize. But one thing maybe a take point for me is that no one is an expert in overlooked cities. And also reflecting back on the notion of overlooked city itself. Where we were started like 5 years ago about working on small and medium-sized city, and we come up with this edited collection. And I think my colleague Hannah will have the right to say how he came up with the idea of overlooked cities. But really, all maybe we are not supposed to use overlooked cities anymore a lot. Maybe just a different kind of term in order to really provoke on what we really want. Because a couple days ago when we are organizing the event, I got question: are we really being overlooked from the local communities that we are going to visit on Friday? So yeah, that's a question for us to think about. Yeah, can I check if there's any online question from the online audience? No. Or Malik as well.
Is that because we are obviously not in dialogue before we prepare our presentation?
What do I need to say?
So maybe how do you think about all of a part of the session this morning as well, and thinking about the notion of overlooked cities, and also oh, we do have a question. Okay, yeah. Yeah, maybe one question first from Ibu Elizabeth. You want first? Yeah, Ibu Elizabeth.
Yeah. Oh, for Lana? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think the question for all the speaker could similar topic, a similar presentation. So my question is like, Burita and Pak Hung, yeah. Actually, when I heard about the overlooked city, it's really make me like thinking, what is overlooked city? And then my question, when we talk about the overlooked city, based on this, what is the presentation from in the morning until right now, we only focus in the society on the people. So my question, if when we talk about the overlooked city, if we only focus on the society of the people, or we can concern about the environmental or the culture, because sometimes when we do development, we don't care about the landscape. For example, Burita, if you've been go to Jayapura, Papua, and then you see a lot of they do development, and then they changing all the environmental, all the ecosystem due to development. And then the second only one. So because we talk about the overlooked city, and then how can we contribute to the problem? We are here discussion, but how can we push to we can influence or interference to the government to think about what we do right now? Thank you.
Can I just add a small related point on that? How can, on decentering and decolonizing knowledge on overlooked cities, how can non-conventional forms of knowledge and practice contribute to theorizing and talking about cities? For example, the knowledge of field workers, the knowledge of enumerators, village elders, gatekeepers in the community, specifically because they talk in a different linguistic language as well as a different technical language. So how can those knowledges also contribute to discussing overlooked cities?
Maybe just have one final question for Adiwan and then our speaker and respond.
Okay, thank you. So I have two questions. First is regarding the definition of overlook itself. Because there are things, especially in global south, that we see it every day or we experience it every day. So for us, it's not overlooked because we look at every day. But for people from outside, they think that we overlook it. For example, in the last 7 years, I've been approached by universities in UK, Netherlands, and also in Australia to look at on how informal economies has worked in Indonesia, especially in urban kampungs. While when I look at other scholars in Indonesia, they're very limited understanding or works on this topic, which then become a new gap for me. And even I just realized that after they approached me to work together. And second one I want to ask you is that regarding the publication, how do we define that these overlooked cities are worth it to be published for the reviewers or maybe for the editors itself? Because they will think think that the city either is not too famous or not too interesting. So why should we publish them? So those kind of thing, I think, could also be a obstacle for us to publish in about overlooked cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up now and then, open for speaker if you want to respond to any of this question. Then.
Thank you, Bu Elizabeth. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, as I was thinking about the term overlooked and overlooked cities, there are two things actually. One is that even if the existence of a city itself is never independent of the supporting areas that are involved in making the city possible. There is no city that can stand on its own. So by actually just looking at a city, we may be overlooking a lot of things. Yeah. And so I think the example of Papua is really a case in point that we do see landscapes that are quite distinct, and it's really even comparing the coastal areas and the mountains. They're really different, and there are a lot of dynamics that are happening in the mountains that also contributes to actually the prosperity of other areas. But what is happening in the mountains are being overlooked. So and that's also contributing to the increasing prosperity of other cities as well, not just cities in Papua, but also cities outside Papua, including cities in Java. Right? Because a lot of the actors who are doing business over there are actually not from Papua. And they're from all over the world, basically. So I'm also wondering, when we are using the term overlooked, actually, areas that are overlooked are often not in the cities, because but they are in a way part of the city as well, because the cities cannot exist without them. I guess it's also connected somewhat with the very familiar, planetary urbanization concept by Brenner and Schmidt, that, even if we say that so and so much area is urbanized, but actually probably the whole planet is already very much connected with it. But secondly, also in terms of overlooking inside cities themselves, sometimes I feel that as I'm studying communities in the cities that are often overlooked, sometimes I feel that being overlooked probably is also part of the strategy, in a sense that as long as being overlooked is actually a result of a choice of a human agency of the communities over there, it can be a part of a strategy of not being co-opted by the mainstream urban development. And by being overlooked, probably it will save it from being gentrified, from being displaced. Being overexposed actually would actually carry over investments from other places. So I'm also not sure about this, because that's just my own observation, but it's probably something that we also need to be conscious about when we say be overlooking, by whom, and is it who is intentionally overlooking and who is intentionally making it overlooked. And we need to respect that if there is a conscious choice by the communities to choose to be overlooked somehow as a strategy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you want to comment about centering light and publication?
Okay. Again, I mean, it's a huge topic, which can probably go on. We can discuss for many days, weeks, and still not able to resolve these. So again, for the sake of dinner, I try to make it concise for now, and we can just continue discussing this during the dinner time and onward. Just very, very briefly, just kind of in 2 points as a response. Small overlooked cities, or whichever cities that you define, which do not appear prominently in existing academic scholarship, I would say, I mean, don't assume that these journals wouldn't accept papers which discuss such cities. I say this with some based on my own experience as an IJOR, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research editor. When a paper comes in that discusses cities which have not been explored, I'll be thrilled, and I know many my fellow editors will be excited to have those papers. The disappointment is emerges when such cities are discussed in a either very descriptive way, and then we try to encourage if the paper can be improved further, so that it doesn't remain too descriptive, or whether when the discussion doesn't get related to the larger discussion about the topic that they are trying to address. I think this is important because what we try to do in terms of theorizing from and about overlooked cities or any other cities is to show how the existing understanding about certain urban phenomena can be revisited and challenged because they haven't taken such processes which are taking place elsewhere or in overlooked cities were not taken into consideration. So this is our task, all of us, to actually say, well, what has been discussed about displacement, eviction, infrastructure, citizenship, whatever topic that you are going to work with or address, that has been discussed in this particular way. But when I look at what's going on in my own, overlooked city, quote unquote, that needs to be revised and needs to be updated. And that's something very often missing in those papers, and therefore they get sent back to authors for additional work. And I think more and more colleagues I know are feeling more sympathetic and supportive in order to make sure such authors are given a bit more room and space, time to actually improve their works, and they don't get rejected right away. Well, of course, still there needs to be more effort to be done, and this is where I keep saying need to kind of produce the network of scholars and to actually do this in a collective manner, and also in a way that actually allow us to put together resources, human resources, financial resources, and so on, in order to make sure such projects can continue and in a meaningful scale. And that's something very difficult to achieve. And I hope an institute like IDI, if it's resource rich, can set aside a bit of work a resource to actually contribute to this kind of process. Now, going back to the previous question about the languages and the experiences experienced and faced by local villagers and so on, that's very important. Again, one of the things that IJOR was introduced recently is a part of a book reviews, which we named our book review editor, Joanna Kusiak, was naming this when she introduced this initiative, Interviews, to review books written in non-English languages in order for them to receive more attention. So there was one that came out, and another one or two in the pipeline. But that's only one small, meaningful, but still small initiative. And I think many of these still do require huge resources. Translation very difficult. I was as part of SEAC working paper series initially when I was setting up the SEAC working paper series. I was very ambitious. I was aiming to translate each working paper into at least 6 Southeast Asian languages. And each translation was costing £2,000. And I was like, whoa, one working paper coming being published, and in order for them to be made available in 6 different languages, that's going to cost £12,000 per paper. And I was like, no, that's not feasible. And I think this is the real challenge, and because of the way publishing industry has been structured, because of the way such a volume of work that involves, it is very difficult. But it is important. We still have to continue doing this because, as I was saying earlier, for them it's the universe and the world, and it needs to be narrated from their perspectives, and that narration cannot be only in academic language. Once they are trying to be converted into academic language, it loses meaning, significance very quickly. And this is where, just to kind of go back to what Emin was discussing in one of his earlier papers, the translation return in urban studies. And I think that's, one of the ways in which we can actually do more as an academics, where, we try not to, translate every local expressions into existing English language. And nowadays I try, whenever possible, encourage my own students, well, just to Romanize the local expression, at least if you want to write those use those in their thesis, rather than trying to basically put them into like an English language, right? So that in the process, all the rich meanings get lost. So I think that it will be important for scholars. And I know some of you may feel like, if I do this, would my paper get rejected because it's written in a language, Romanized expression of local language, which is not easily understood by reviewers and editors. But the more editors are, I would say, critical scholars who are acting as editors will feel more sympathetic towards such initiatives. And it is important for scholars operating purely in English settings to be made uncomfortable. I think that's really important. We need to make them feel more uncomfortable by coming across with different expressions that cannot be easily translated into English. And the more we do this collectively and in large numbers en masse, the sooner or the quicker it can be achieved. And I think that's probably only the starting point. I wouldn't say that's the ending point. That's the only starting point, after which we can probably think of more initiatives.
Thank you so much. Yeah. On my note, there's no specific question to Malik, but I think there's one reflection from Heidi about, the direction from UK Netherlands for urban camp, and whether you want to weigh in from what we just discussed, Malik, and maybe, in relation to your research about, urban extension or urban surrounds, if you want. Or still with us, Malik? Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. I think we are reached toward the end of the plenary talk. Once again, really thank you so much for all the speaker, Dr. Padawangi, Professor Simons, Professor Huens. Thank you everyone who are joining us online. So we will taking out all the notes, provocations, questions that we have discussed before. And once again, on behalf of the Overlook Cities Collective, Hannah, Isolde, Yimin, Julia, and myself, thank you again, everyone. Thank you, and good afternoon. Okay, so the next part of the program is so for the conference participant, you have a little bit of free times until 6:30. We'll have a dinner again, so you are welcome if you want to join the dinner on the 3rd floor. And in the evening, starting from 7:30, we'll have a film screening with the 3 fantastic films from our participants, and the film screening will be here. So you are welcome to join us again here from 7:30 to 9:30. Isolde, do you think